And good evening and welcome to the Science and Politics show again. And as usual, we've got lots to discuss. So having a little look at the programme this evening, we're going to be talking about dishonesty in Parliament and what we can actually do about it. And I will have, talking to me, Peter Stefanovic, who has done that video, that 12 million views viral video. After discussing with Peter where that has taken him in terms of mechanisms in Parliament to try and call this out, we will move on to talking about the Super League of Greed and what this all means for our culture in general, particularly our political culture, that greed can run away so badly from us. We will also be talking about our NHS, our abandoned NHS. Nothing has happened from this government since that pathetic 1% pay rise. Lots of frontline staff are feeling hopelessly abandoned, while crony friends of the government seem to be doing rather well out of it. So I'll be talking with Pushpo from Doctors Association UK about what the mood at the front line is and what needs to be done. And then, of course, we are going to be talking about James Dyson and those texts. And was it appropriate or not? And was Dyson even any use anyway? So that's the programme for this evening. So first up, let's talk about dishonesty in Parliament. Now, we all know that Boris Johnson is probably the best documented liar in the United Kingdom. There's reams and reams of it, but it becomes an even more serious offence when you make misleading statements in Parliament. Who is doing anything about Boris Johnson making misleading statements in Parliament? Well, Peter Stefanovic regularly makes videos about politics, about Parliament, and he had one video where he called out a string of Boris Johnson's lies in Parliament, and it has now soared past 12 million views. So if you haven't seen it yet, you're going to see it now. If you've seen it already, you're going to see it again because it's worth repeating. George, could you play the 2 minutes 20 video that is taken off on Twitter?
We have cut CO2 emissions in this country since 2010 on 1990 levels by 42%. 42%. That is an astonishing achievement.
Well, it would be if it were true, but it's just another lie. CO2 emissions fell by 39% between 1990 and 2018, not from 2010 onwards.
The economy under this Conservative government has grown by 73%.
Another lie. In the period since 2010 and prior to the pandemic, it was about 20%. The 73% he's referring to is for the whole period since 1990, 13 years of which was under Labour governments.
We've restored the nurses' bursary.
Another lie. A maintenance grant for student nurses is not a return of the student nurses' bursary. Thanks to the Conservative government scrapping the nurses' bursary, they still have to pay extortionate tuition fees and still qualify tens of thousands of pounds in debt.
And ensure there will be a free hospital car parking for everybody who attends a hospital.
Just another lie.
Absolute poverty, relative poverty have both declined under this government, and there are hundreds of thousands, I think 400,000 fewer families living in poverty now than there were in 2010.
More lies. The number of people in relative poverty in the UK has increased from 13.6 million in 2010 to 14.5 million in 2019. And as for his claim that 400,000 fewer families are living in poverty, well, it appears he just made that up.
The app would be the icing on the cake. Well, if we can get it to work, it will be a fine thing, but there isn't one anywhere in the world so far.
Another lie. At the time, track and trace apps were being used in France, Germany, Australia, Poland, Latvia, Denmark, Japan, Italy.
He will know that the government is engaged in record investments in the NHS, £34 billion.
Another lie. In real terms, it's a spending increase of just 20.5 billion. The Institute for Fiscal Studies points out that's less than funding used to rise under Labour.
We've absolutely determined to support
childcare.
You've just increased child benefit by 35 pence a week.
Right, and so to discuss where developments on that are now, because it's been followed up from that video to, as you might have seen, a big group of opposition party leaders getting together to try and do something about this in Parliament. So I have with me Peter Stefanovic. How are you? I've got you with me here on Zoom. Great to see you again.
Very well.
Good.
Thank you for having me on the show.
Yeah, and next time, let's get you actually here in the studio when everything
Just give me
comes.
a bit more notice, Mike, and I'll be there.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Look, you don't do this to me like live, right? But yes, I should have given Peter more notice than this afternoon about coming in. So we've got him on Zoom instead, but I will make up for my sins and bring him in studio at some point in the future. We've agreed on that. So, Peter, this particular video, you've done lots and lots of videos. I mean, you're a bulldog on this, you're a warrior on this, but this particular video took off and kept going. Why do you think it is?
I guess I'll answer that with my motivation for making this particular film. And that, I think, kind of plays into why I think it's taken off and resonated with so many people. As a lawyer, I think about things like the crime of perjury in our courts, which is taken very, very seriously because the foundation of our legal system is based on truth and honesty and credibility. And my view is that should apply equally to our parliamentary institutions, because if our parliamentary institutions are allowed to be undermined by lies and false statements made in Parliament, then our very democracy is put at risk. But going beyond that, and from a more emotional angle, I guess one of my big motivations for the film, and why I think this has really played into the public psyche, is that I think about my mum and dad, who are not with me anymore, sadly. But when I think of them, I think about their almost stoic honesty. And when I think about when I was growing up and the people around me, I think about their honesty. And I would be told things, I would hear things, and I might not always like what I was told or what I was heard, but more likely than not, I felt that I was being told the truth. And I feel that is being lost. And I saw an article actually just a couple of days ago, and the article kicked off with, well, everybody lies, don't they? Well, I disagree with that, because I believe that the majority of people in this country are inherently honest. I don't know about you, Mike, but I haven't
I'm
told
honest.
any lies.
I know you didn't mean to put it like that, but yes. I concur.
I mean, you told the truth about why I'm not in the studio tonight and why we're on the telephone, or rather why we're on Zoom. I wouldn't deliberately lie to or deceive someone. You wouldn't. Our friends and our neighbours wouldn't. And the problem and I think this is why this is resonates.
No, you're right, because in wider society, in British society, people don't complain about corruption at the society level. We don't rip each other off left, right and centre. We don't see that as associated with being British. And yet, at the top of our politics, it's absolutely rampant. So there is a real distinction there between how we operate in common society in this country and what we see in politics.
I agree, and moving beyond that, if the guy at the top is playing fast and loose with the truth, then those below him are then going to be emboldened to do the same, if only to become complicit in covering up the lie and false statements that he's put forward. So we're in a terrible situation at the moment, and that was my motivation behind that particular film, and I think that's why it's resonated with so many people, as you say, over 12 million views, which is astonishing.
And for you, it's quite an emotional thing, because I mean we've chatted plenty of times before where you've also said on Twitter, you know, I can't do this anymore, I can't do this anymore. I keep talking about this and putting it out there. It's not cutting through, you know, how I'd like. What do I do? What do I do? But then you always come back and you keep pushing it again, and you find another surge to keep going.
You know, you sometimes you feel that, you know, they want to wear you down, so that you just give up. And all we can do is just keep coming back and coming back and coming back until we break through. And I think that's what's happened here. You know, I think we've witnessed something quite astonishing with this particular film, in that literally hundreds of thousands of people have stepped up and said, I want to share this film with my family, with my friends, with my neighbors, with my work colleagues, because I think everyone should see this film. And it's because so many people have come together collectively. I couldn't have done this on my own. People have come together collectively, and they've shared this film in their hundreds of thousands because it's resonated with them, and that's what's taken it to more than 12 million views. And then you lead on from that into, well, now we can see that through our media platforms we are having a positive impact, in that we've now seen this coalition of opposition parties who have come together to try and do something about this. Now, the coalition that we're talking about, which is all opposition parties apart from Labour, unfortunately, has been put together by Caroline Lucas. So I can't take any credit for the coalition. That was Caroline Lucas driving that forward. She was very
Caroline first,
kind,
or did she come to you?
No, Caroline put the coalition together herself, but she very kindly has said that I saw in a Guardian interview that she had been in part inspired to put that coalition together because of my film. And indeed, if you look at the letter that has been drafted to the speaker, which has been signed by so many of the opposition party leaders, in large part it mirrors many of the issues that I raised in my film. So what we're seeing here is people, you know, the people in this country taking back control themselves and saying, look, we've had enough of this, and we want to do something. And we're going to do something by sharing this video. And if mainstream media are unwilling to report it, then we'll do it ourselves.
There's an interesting question, Peter, because there has been plenty of international attention to it and reporting on it, and you could argue more so than in the UK itself, even though this is pertinent to us. Why is that happening?
I mean, when this thing hit, 10 million views, it was being reported in France, in Spain, in Italy, but it was getting no coverage at all on say the BBC. I mean, last week the BBC, when this film was at 10 million views, found time to report to its viewers about a tree monster that turned out to be a croissant and a dog that had learnt to walk on two legs. But it didn't find time to report a film highlighting a shameful pattern of behaviour in our Prime Minister that had been watched over 10 million times at that point.
1 in 6 people in the country.
You'll have to ask BBC One why they think a tree monster that turns out to be a croissant and a dog that's learnt to walk on two legs is more important information for the public.
Is it because we're in denial in this country, I wonder? Because we have heard other sounds coming out of the BBC that they feel very uncomfortable. I mean, Peter Oborne, who we've had on this show, was saying it, and I know he's a great supporter of yours and you're a great supporter of his, but he was reporting that within the BBC, people have expressed to him that they feel very uncomfortable about calling a lie when it comes from our Prime Minister. So it could be a massive blind spot that's being exploited. So
I agree. I think that, Mike, it's important to say that although more mainstream media, the BBC, Sky, ITV, have decided that this is not something that the public needs to know about. You know, dogs walking on two legs are more important. We with this particular film have taken back control ourselves. I mean, we're creating our own media platforms that are having a huge impact. And although you can't really compare like for like, the most watched show on ITV last year had about 11.2 million views, whereas this particular video has been watched over 12 million times.
Yep.
So I know you can't necessarily compare like to like there, but this has had a huge impact. And even without BBC One reporting it, because for whatever reason they don't think the public need to know about this, we've got the attention of opposition party leaders who have come together to launch this action. And what the form of this action?
Yes, please tell me about that.
Yeah. Well, a letter has been drawn up highlighting a whole raft of false statements and untruths made by Boris Johnson to MPs in Parliament. And these are being listed. Many of them actually mirror, as I say, what I talk about in my film. And this letter has been sent to the Speaker, the guardian of the Commons integrity.
Yep.
And they've said to the Speaker, we the opposition party leaders that have signed this, every party bar Labour, we would like you to list a motion so that we can call attention to these false statements and untruths and have a vote on whether or not this matter should be referred to the Committee on Standards and Privileges, because we believe this amounts to a contempt of court. And if this endless drip of false statements from the Prime Minister does not amount to a contempt of Parliament, what does? Now, of course, what we're waiting to hear on is whether or not the Speaker will agree to let this motion go forward. So, I mean, the Speaker could say, no, I'm not going to let it go forward. But, you know,
this
you come
is quite
back
a test of the Speaker in many people's eyes. I mean, a lot of people have complained that he's not been taking these actions. I mean, Peter Oborne has written to him before with a similar kind of nudge. But off the back of what you've done, you've actually now got parliamentary parties that have landed it on his desk through a parliamentary process, and the pressure is on him now to whether he wants to acknowledge it.
It's going to be really difficult, I think, for him to say no to this motion, because in March of this year, he told MPs that they had to be truthful, and if they said something that was not truthful, they had, or not factually correct, they had to correct the parliamentary record. And that's not been happening. So, I mean, where do you go?
And Keir Starmer did that about his support or otherwise of the European Medicines Agency. When he misunderstood, he came back and corrected it immediately. But Boris Johnson never has. But speaking about Keir Starmer, because I think this is important too, you said that Labour didn't get on board. And I know that there were various people who tried to encourage, I mean, yourself included, obviously, to encourage Labour to come on board or even lead the initiative should they wish. But Labour didn't. So please tell me what exactly happened there.
I've got no idea, Mike. I mean, you're going to have to ask Labour and Keir about that. But they were invited to come on board with the initiative. Every opposition party leader has signed the letter to the Speaker requesting he list a motion so that Boris Johnson's false statements in Parliament can be called out apart from Keir. And all I can tell you as to his reasoning for not doing that is what we've seen put out by the Labour Party, which is a statement which I think was along the lines of, well, we don't traditionally sign up to initiatives from other parties. Now, my reaction to that was, well, hang on a sec, surely this is something in which we should be putting the country first. But yeah, I'm very disappointed that Labour decided
Well,
not to
he's
come
certainly
on
signed
this,
up
but
to government initiatives, whether it be
yeah,
lockdowns or other measures. So
yeah,
Labour is fully capable of backing something
yeah,
that they believe in.
yeah,
They've done it
yeah.
with the Conservatives. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, but we crack on. You know, we
Yeah.
move on. If the Labour Party decided not to move forward with us on this, that's their prerogative. But I'm not going to sit in the corner and cry about that. I'm just going to crack on with this and see where it takes us. And the next stage, of course,
we've got to wrap up now. But could you
Yeah.
summarise what cracking on means, and also
Yeah.
when we're likely to hear about the next steps, when we're likely to get a response from the Speaker, how long that might take, what you're planning to do next? Give us a brief summary of what happens over the next couple of weeks or so.
Okay, over the next couple of weeks, cracking on then, a letter signed by 6 opposition party leaders has gone to the Speaker asking for the matter to be listed for a motion so that this can be discussed in Parliament. We are waiting for him to say yes or no. If he says yes, it will go forward. There'll be a debate and then there'll be a vote. If he says no, then I would be extremely concerned, because there's a very limited parliamentary gateway for holding a prime minister to account who is less than truthful. Let's see what happens next week.
Okay, so next week is what we're watching on and waiting on.
Well, I'm hoping we'll have some news next week, but let's wait and see.
Brilliant. Thanks ever so much, Peter.
It was lovely to chat, Mike.
Yes, and let's get you in here next time with good notice, and then with plenty of beer or wine or whatever you choose to indulge in.
It will be fun.
Good. All right. Thanks. Right. So this is something that I think increasingly needs to be addressed. I mean, it always needs to be addressed, but it feels very much as though it's building to a crescendo. There is something going on in the culture at the moment that and from many different angles, whether it be the contracts over PPE, the test and trace, the lying, certainly a lot of the lying around Brexit, whether there'd be no non-tariff barriers at the border and so forth and so on. There's just so much of it now piling on that it's really built quite a cultural shift, which you can feel with this government. And woven into all the lying and misstatements and so forth and so on is also the factor of greed, which we have seen come to the fore very sharply with the European Super League that was suddenly flown and then got shot down by absolutely everyone, because everyone saw it for what it was, which was rich, wealthy, powerful clubs deciding to pull a fast one and try to stitch things up so that they retain themselves in power for the foreseeable with big money, allowing all of the system which had nurtured them to date to that stage, the fans, the local towns, being left behind on that. And much as though Boris Johnson jumped in quickly to try and point out the unacceptability of this move on their part, it is very much something that he is part of. So I recorded before, researched and got down on paper and then delivered to camera what I think about the Super League and Boris Johnson and greed. So George, if you could play that little video there, I'd be very grateful. As the Super League falls apart, it has been the naked greed that was universally identified as the motivating factor behind it. Greed at the expense of everything that really matters. And greed seems to be a rising theme in today's politics, with David Cameron engaging in sleazy lobbying for the failed Greensill in order to line his own pockets. And just last month, Boris Johnson told backbench MPs that the reason we've had the vaccine success is because of capitalism, because of greed, my friends. He once said Labour detest the profit motive and claimed no one stuck up for the bankers as much as I did when those bankers crashed our economy through their greed and went unpunished. This country, and particularly this government, has embraced greed for far too long. As our frontline staff in the NHS have put their lives at risk for a pittance, this government casually justified consultants being paid £7,000 a day, that's 2.6 million a year each, for their advice to a failed test and trace system. And they have wildly overpaid greedy friends for PPE, greedy friends who've now bought themselves plush mansions, and some of whom are already making donations back to the Conservative Party. The greed is rampant, and Boris Johnson will of course point to the Super League and point to Cameron with a look over their tactic. But the truth is this, he is very much part of the same school. Remember also that Boris Johnson was reported last year to be grumpy about his prime ministerial salary and jealous of his predecessors like May and Blair, who've been making millions in speaking engagements since leaving office. When he was Mayor of London, Johnson was challenged about earning £250,000 a year on the side as a journalist, an extraordinary amount which Johnson dismissed as chicken feed. Was that greed behind the charity to provide Boris with £200,000 to do up Downing Street to Carrie's satisfaction? Or why the public had to spend £1 million on painting a jet for Boris Johnson's travels, and then a second jet? Or 2.6 million of taxpayer money for Boris's own self-indulgent briefing room? Selfish greed, my friends, it is rampant. So that's what I think about that. I really think that we're probably going to see from Boris Johnson an attempt to claim victory on the Super League, bundle it up with David Cameron, and Boris Johnson himself pretend to be the saviour who was rooting out bent coppers, as he claimed in Parliament. But of course that is distraction tactics from very much the culture that he himself has indulged in all of his life and encouraged quite overtly. And that's the thing that, you know, once again makes your blood boil. About the Super League, the problem here is that when you get the big money interests coming in and swooping things away, it's very, very disempowering for the people. It's a similar kind of feeling with the NHS. We all know that the NHS was born out of our society, taking care of each other, and that's what we want to keep a hold of and promote, that understanding that the nurses and the doctors and the other staff of the NHS are there for us. Their primary interests in the NHS is to take care of us, and we have an interest in them. So when you have big companies coming in and inserting the profit motive between that community relationship between fans and clubs or public and doctors and nurses, that's when you feel as though you as a citizen, you as a supporter, you as a person who identifies with your country, your town or your city, that something is being ripped away from you. You're being disempowered, because all of our forefathers and foremothers have built this country, or built football clubs, or built other institutions to be what they are. That is an inheritance that we get down. That should belong to us a lot more directly than it does. And it should not belong to wealthy foreign companies that can sweep in and treat us all as customers. So I do see a great parallel there. And on the subject of the NHS, I want to move on to the next topic, which is about the NHS and how we take care of them, because they have done such a fantastic job at taking care of us throughout this pandemic, you know, with mask sores, working long hours, seeing deaths in ICUs at a horrendous rate compared to what they're used to. But then what are we giving back in return? Because this government recently gave them a measly 1% pay rise, which does not keep up with inflation, and the support that they need is falling away left, right and centre, and it seems to be an issue which has dropped off the map, which is why I'm delighted to have with me Pushpo, again on Zoom, from Doctors Association UK, one of the committee members of Doctors Association UK, frontline staff herself, in order to discuss how exactly doctors and nurses and frontline staff and care workers are feeling at the moment. Pushpa, are you there?
Yes, I am. Hi.
Hiya.
Thank you for having me.
Well, thanks for coming on. And I guess first question is, what's the mood like now? I mean, right at the beginning of the pandemic, you know, there was all the clapping, yada yada, and we were hearing a lot from nurses at the time points when it was about the 1% pay rise, but they seem to be ignored by the mainstream media now. What's the mood?
Well, after the pandemic, and I mean, it's still ongoing, but after fighting the first wave and the second wave, yes, the clapping, it was a boost to the morale. But when the government announced that we were going to be awarded 1%, it was like a slap on our face. We feel very, very betrayed at the moment. And it's just very difficult. It's very hard digesting. We feel very insulted that the government thought that we were worth the 1% raise.
Yeah, and there was lots of talk at the time that, you know, this would be followed up and this would be challenged. Is there anything ongoing? I mean, are there any efforts in Parliament to redress this or to review this? Is there any contact between your organisation and the government that gives you any indication that things are going to change there?
Unfortunately, we haven't heard anything that's encouraging from that perspective. In fact, the Doctors Association UK, we are campaigning for our international healthcare workers to be granted indefinite leave to remain automatically for their contribution during the pandemic, as well as we're campaigning for fair NHS pay. So we're constantly campaigning for a respectable pay rise with a COVID bonus, because clearly the government hasn't promised and hasn't told us that there's an indication for any kind of review of such.
Yep. So there are two strands there that I want to focus on. Firstly is nurses and doctors overall, and their remuneration and their other needs. And then there's a separate strand, which is critical as well, which is about the international doctors and nurses and workers in our NHS and how they're being treated in this country versus in comparator countries. So to focus on the first one first, was it not said very recently that there will be no bonus for frontline staff? There will be no COVID bonus for frontline staff. And isn't it also the case that parking fees, which were temporarily dropped, are going to come back in?
Yes, that's correct. The parking fees are actually already back in certain trusts, and the COVID bonus, even I think yesterday's paper, they've confirmed that nurses are not going to receive any kind of COVID bonus, which is a shame, really, because here we are having risked our lives, now being told that there is going to be nothing. There is going to be no COVID bonus, a measly rise of just 1%, which is literally a kick in the teeth. And, and also international healthcare workers. There has been no effort from the government to say that we're going to be granted indefinite leave to remain automatically, even though many of the doctors that have lost lives have an international background. So it just goes to show, like, the government is definitely not valuing its healthcare workers again.
And the government is absolutely dependent on international healthcare workers filling the NHS. There's been huge recruitment drives in order to plug the gaps because the government hasn't taken care of our own pipelines. So we're critically dependent on people from all over the world that want to come and save our lives in our country here. So the example of France, if you could talk about that, because they have explicitly acknowledged the work of their medical staff and healthcare staff from other countries, and they've given them automatic citizenship or something like that?
Yes, that's correct. And, that's the thing. Like, when you see neighboring countries like France, who have been generous, who've been basically, they've recognized the contribution of these international healthcare workers, and then gone ahead and rewarded them with automatic citizenship, which is something that we were expecting in the UK, because we had such a terrible first wave and a second wave, and we've lost so many of our comrades who are of international background. And the government only had a very ridiculous bereavement scheme, which said that only if an international healthcare worker died during service with COVID-19, their families would get ILR. But what about all the international healthcare workers who are, suffering from long-lasting
that had to be campaigned
COVID?
for. I remember that had to be campaigned for, because initially that wasn't their right. And initially, if they were international healthcare workers in the UK, their families wouldn't even get the compensation that British-born frontline staff would get. And there was a campaign on that, and the government U-turned on it. But to think that that was their default position as well, surely that's got to be pretty demoralising for people who've come from other countries to work in our NHS.
Yes, definitely. It does demoralize a lot of our staff, and we're in a situation where we are heavily dependent on so many international healthcare workers, starting from doctors all the way down to porters and paramedic staff.
Yep.
It's unfair,
levels.
really.
Yeah, at all levels of the big team that takes care of our health. And has there been anyone expressing sentiments that they're going to leave the country and go home and get out of here?
Unfortunately, many people have expressed these sentiments, where they're saying that, we were not recognized. There is no promise of ILR. There is no promise of any COVID bonus, and the pay rise is just 1%, which doesn't even meet demands. As you said, it doesn't meet the inflation rate. It doesn't even meet the ILR cost per applicant, which is around £2,500 per person.
Interesting. Yeah. And then there's the NHS surcharge, which was waived at a lot of international healthcare workers as well, which is utterly bizarre. And then also on top of that, the British Medical Association, their pensions unit, was complaining about freezes in the pension, which means that pension pots are actually going to be devalued for doctors in the NHS, meaning that many will also retire early because it's not worth their while to keep working longer. So it seems as though there's just multiple abuses on many, many levels, and then even more added on if you have come from another country to come and help save the lives of Brits. It seems quite mad.
Well, unfortunately, that's how it is. And it's just a shame to really think that the government comes ahead and says, well, this is what we can only afford, only a 1% raise. Whereas you have news, and even the National Audit Office has come forward and said that billions have been spent on PPE contracts.
Yes.
That went to people who supported the Tory government, whereas they don't have money to give the healthcare workers who've risked their lives for the pandemic.
Actually,
So
Kaylin, could you bring me the newspapers there on the side? Because this has been covered in the news today. Yep, so here we go. Just in the news today is they're taking the PPE, and it says more than 3.5 billion of taxpayers' money may have been corruptly given out by the government to companies during the PPE crisis at the start of the pandemic. At least 73 contracts last year, 1 in 5 of those awarded merit further investigation for potential criminality. So when you bear that in mind, and also, we have on Byline TV before, on this board behind me, which now reads greed, gone through a flow diagram of the PPE where 12.5 billion was spent to buy 2.5 billion pounds worth of PPE. So much spent, sixfold inflation on prices, and then a lot of those going to their mates who are, now sitting around in newly purchased properties. So surely, I would imagine that also rubs at the NHS staff, that they see so much money going off at the top level to friends, but they themselves, who really need the money and have been putting their lives on the line, just aren't getting it.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And, and when you see that the healthcare workers were queuing up at food banks because, we're not being able to make our ends meet. And here we are hearing about all this news where they had the money for that, but none for us. Yeah. Which is heartbreaking, very demoralizing.
And I worry about the frontline healthcare workers as well, in terms of mental health and having enough resources for that. And also those that have caught coronavirus now have long COVID, with this government still hasn't recognised it as an occupational disease, like they have on the continent. Recognise that you're in higher danger from catching coronavirus and developing long COVID if you're actually in that environment where you're at risk. And this has been acknowledged by many European countries, but still not in the UK. So where's the support for those nurses and doctors and other staff in that environment?
And yes, and I'd like to add to that international healthcare workers, if they develop long COVID and it results in them not being able to carry out with their services, they actually face the risk of deportation, which is again unfair because we caught COVID during the pandemic. We're now suffering from long COVID, and then we are also at risk of deportation because we are not fit for service.
And could be deported, presumably with their families after. Yes. Right, okay, that's a specific one that I want to follow up on. That's quite horrendous, and I think that needs particular addressing itself. And I'd like to follow up with you and Doctors Association UK about that after the show, because I think that's a real particular consideration. Well, last question then, just very last one, is what do you think can be done now? Where do you think changes can be made, and how? You've got Doctors Association UK and you've got other campaign groups campaigning, but where do you think is the most likely place where a breakthrough could come?
Well, for starters, that we should have a respectable pay rise, not that 1%. The government can give us a respectable pay rise because we've worked exceptionally hard throughout the period.
But how do we make that happen?
Well, Doctors Association UK is already campaigning for it, and we're just hoping that that the government, the public, they take notice and they take some steps forward and get the healthcare workers who deserve the pay rise, who deserve a COVID bonus, and get it done. And also, international healthcare workers should not have to campaign or fight for these things. Actually, no healthcare worker should be fighting for these things. It's a shame that we are now saying that we have to fight for this. It's something that should have been recognized and rewarded.
For example, or do you have any? Do you have, for example, the Labour Party that can bring in something on Opposition Day motion? Have you got ideas about how to escalate it through mechanisms like that?
Well, so Doctors Association UK is closely working with different groups at the moment, and we hope that I can't really disclose those projects at the moment.
Yes, and what you've got cooking, you're not going to spill. Okay, yeah. Understood. Well, in which case, best of luck. Many thanks for coming on, and I'd like to talk to you after the show about some of those issues, particularly this idea that you could be deported as a foreign NHS worker if you catch coronavirus while trying to save people from coronavirus. That's nuts, and that really needs to be tackled very, very specifically. Thanks ever so much.
Thank you.
Right, for me, that just boils my blood, and that's very, very upsetting. And it clearly does so much to undermine the whole national spirit that we had at the beginning of the pandemic, where people were well behaved, as in kind of like they did self-isolate when they had symptoms. They were strict about it, and then that was blown by Dominic Cummings. And then everyone thought we were in this together, but then they saw the contracts, the lavish contracts being given out and systems failing. And then we were all clapping the NHS and holding them up as heroes. And Boris Johnson himself said, they saved my life. And how does he repay them for not just saving his life, but saving so many lives? It's treating our frontline staff like this. And it really has soured the whole mood compared to the beginning of the pandemic, where it did look like a national effort, where we were all in it together and we were recognizing the right heroes. And that, for me, is the thing that has absolutely been destroyed by an incompetent, selfish, greedy government, which is in dereliction of its duties. Right, so in this cheery show this evening, we have one more bit for you, which is about the Dyson texting with Boris Johnson. So this, for me, I find quite fascinating, because when it was called out in Parliament that Boris Johnson had a special route in via his phone for his Brexiteer buddies that wanted tax changes, Boris Johnson defended it by saying, well, I'll do everything that I don't apologise at all. I'll do everything that I need to do in order to make sure that we get ventilators in to save people's lives. Which is a really odd thing to say, given that he was being pulled up on tax breaks for mates. It's kind of like he was saying, we would only get those ventilators if I gave tax breaks to Dyson and his employees. So it's a really odd way for Boris Johnson to defend himself. But there's another twist to it as well, which is this notion that has been peddled by some people that Boris Johnson was absolutely right to call up James Dyson on the phone and get him involved in it because, God damn it, we needed everything we could get, is patently false, because at the same time, Boris Johnson and the government as a whole was also rejecting or overlooking offers of ventilator supply from standard medical suppliers that had already been supplying the government. They were trying to make this available to the government and being ignored or being battered back. But Boris Johnson and crew decided to seek out the grand JCB Brexiteer, Lord Bamford, and Dyson, another Brexiteer, to do British brand, knock it together like a Spitfire built from tin tubs, as we did in World War II, which is completely negligent because, of course, it wouldn't be developed on time and it wouldn't be developed to medical standards on time in order to get distributed everywhere. So it was all for show, and also badly risked the availability of real, proper, professional medical ventilators, which are a piece of kit which interact with your body in very precise ways that you can't get wrong with the inflation and deflation of someone's lives with crude machinery. And for those people who are saying this is Captain Hindsight stuff, at the time you had to jump to it. No, this was being called out at the time as getting it all wrong, including by me. And so here's a clip from March 28th, 2020, talking specifically about the ventilator suppliers that had been knocked back in preference for giving Dyson a shot at building a off-the-cuff British version. George, please. Then they also decided to have this instant call out to Rolls-Royce, Formula One, Dyson, whoever can do it, build us some ventilators, right? But it looks like they screwed up in doing that because they didn't properly, thoroughly check with their own suppliers of ventilators whether they had any more. So there's a report yesterday by The Times saying that Direct Access, which is an NHS supplier in Cheshire, got an extra 5,000 ventilators and offered it to our government. We has 5,000 ventilators here, double capacity, well, quadruple actually working capacity. Do you want it, government? Do you want it? Do you want it? Do you want it? Government didn't reply, so they went and sold it on because, like, there's quite big demand for this around the world right now. And they were also offering them millions of COVID-19 testing kits, which is something that we also need, but the government didn't get back to them. But it's not just that email hiccup. There was also, on Newsnight last week, the director of MEC Medical, another British company that actually manufactures ventilators, saying, why orders being placed with Dyson, who's never made these things before, and it has to go through other tests. I make ones that are approved. Why didn't money come to me so that I could ramp up that supply? And did Dyson actually provide any ventilators that worked or saved lives? No. In fact, we had Germany providing us with 60 mobile ventilators at one stage just to help out. So it was a complete diversion of effort. Now, in the beginning part of that video, I talked about how many ventilators we actually had in the NHS before that offer of 5,000 came in. And it was round about 5,000, but most of which, about, I think it was 75% of which, were already being used. You know, people in ICU beds with ventilators. So we only had a few thousand in the country. This was much less than in Germany, for example, where they had many times more ventilators, but also those ventilators as part of an ICU with ventilator bed. So Germany was much more advanced in this capacity here. We were really skinny on this capacity here, and then our procurement was so poor that we have our own ventilator suppliers desperately trying to get in touch with the Department of Health to say we can double your number of ventilators, which means in terms of working capacity on ventilators, probably quadruple your bandwidth on that, and got no reply. And then there are other manufacturers, and it wasn't just one other, there were various other manufacturers already in this area that weren't sought out because it was all done for show with the big names. And of course that didn't deliver on time. And in fact, beyond that clip that you saw in the same video, I also talked about the fact that Boris Johnson had knocked back the European procurement scheme for ventilators and masks and testing and so forth, but then went and asked Donald Trump for ventilators on the sly, and Donald Trump blurted it out to press saying, you know, we're building ventilators here, and Boris Johnson even asked them for them. So yeah, we'll help them out later. And it didn't make sense at all, because at the time America was short on ventilators. They were having arguments between New York and Donald Trump about who gets what ventilators. They had already pushed in the Defense Procurement Act in order to try and force some of their manufacturers to turn out more ventilators. And as I said in the video, and that was March 28th, we are about 2 to 3 weeks away from the peak, I said. And I was absolutely right, because the 7-day rolling average on deaths actually peaked on the 14th of April, which was 2 weeks and 3 days later. And there was no way in the space of 2 to 3 weeks that America would satisfy and distribute its own ventilator needs and then ship them across the Atlantic to the UK to distribute amongst all of our hospitals. It was fantasy, and it was a very clear indication that Boris Johnson had no idea what he was doing. So that is my that's my summary of the ventilator farce, and I do think we need to go back and revisit that point in time again to show that just how broken and corrupt our system was, that it didn't look for the answers in the right places. It was the same thing with the PPE that we described on this board when I sat down with Sam Bright of Byline Times. And we covered the issue that we had to spend 12.5 billion on PPE to buy 2.5 billion's worth of PPE, 6 times inflated price, because we didn't have any stockpiles of PPE. And we should have had a good 4 months stockpile of PPE in the UK, and that would have covered us through the first wave and meant that we could buy at sensible prices instead of having to buy at rip-off prices. So this is vast waste through cavalier attitudes and stupidity, and going with Dyson was absolutely the wrong move, because at the end of the day it came to nothing. But the focus on that, and the focus on buddies and cronyism, and you call me and I'll do a favour here and you do a favour there, meant that we completely sidelined all the professionalism that could have saved more lives. That is the story there. And that's where I'm going to wrap it up for tonight, because I think we've covered plenty. So what we're going to do, as per usual, is we are going to take a 15-minute break, get some drinks here, and then we can come back and have a chat. It's just me tonight, but if you want to join in on that chat and throw questions my way, you have to be signed up to either the Bylines TV Patreon or the Scientists for EU Patreon. And if you're not signed up to either of those, go now to patreon.com/Scientists for EU, all as one word, or /Byline TV, and sign up, join the supporters club, and then that means that in 15 minutes time on the Byline TV Patreon and on the Scientists for EU Patreon, there will be a link there whereby you can join in on the secret YouTube video, watch it there, throw questions into the comments there, and we all kick back and have a drink and chat about those things. So please go and sign up to one of those two, or go and visit one of those two if you're already signed up, and settle in, and we'll see you back in this room in 15.